Yeah, my name's Bernadette Hunt. I'm the Vice President of Southland Federated Farmers and a proud Southland farmer. I did a tractor talk on Ag Proud NZ's Facebook page, which some of you might have seen. And after that, I had loads of feedback asking for a more detailed video to help farmers with making their submissions. There's loads and loads of information available online, but people are having trouble sometimes wading through all of that, and it's not everyone's cup of tea to read lots of documents. So if that's you, hopefully this video will get you started, and you can go looking for more information on key areas if you want to. If you do want to do that, I'd highly recommend going to the Federated Farmers website. That's fedfarm.org.nz. And on the home page, there's a link under activities to all of the essential freshwater information. It's got links to all of the MFE documents, a really good 4-page summary of the key points for farmers, a summary of the stock exclusion requirements, and some template options for making your submission. Beef and Lamb and Dairy NZ have also issued a fair bit of industry-specific stuff, and I believe that Hort NZ and FAR have both put out things for their growers as well. Before I get into the detail on this video, I just want to make a disclaimer. This video is my own words, my own opinion, my take on this stuff. I'm really careful to make sure that I'm properly informed, and I'm obviously pretty closely connected to the work that Feds is doing on this, but I make no attempt to be neutral, and I'm a farmer. I'm not a scientist or a planner, so you need to form your own opinion, but hopefully this will be helpful. So this plan's extremely significant for New Zealand. There's loads and loads of stuff in it. It's really complex. There's this discussion document, which you can also print online, which is quite thick. There's lots of information in it. There's a draft national policy statement for freshwater management. There's a draft national environment standard for freshwater. And there's the draft stock exclusion requirements. So there's lots of documents that make it up, and it is quite complicated, yet we've only got one shot to have our say and influence this. There's not going to be a select committee process in Wellington. There's no parliamentary approval requirement. This will be approved by Cabinet with no verbal submissions, no more process other than this process that we've got available to us right now. The Minister has promised that Federated Farmers, Beef and Lamb and Dairy NZ will get to be involved in revising the legislation following the submissions, and we'll do everything that we can to hold him to that, but this will be the only formal chance for farmers to have a say. As I said in my tractor talk, the words on the MFE legal documents are what really matter. Just because a minister said you won't have to shift fences or that this won't affect good farmers doesn't mean that's the case. The words in the legal documents totally contradict those comments, and the legal documents are what we'll have to live with long after that minister has moved on. Believe me and your industry groups, this is absolutely a big deal for all farmers and ultimately for everyone in New Zealand due to the financial impacts it will have. I think every farmer supports the intent of sustainable practices, both urban and rural, to protect water, and undoubtedly there are some people who need to lift their game and some organisations that need to lift their game. The biggest concern, though, is the huge cost this will have on all farmers, not just the ones that need to do better. Also, the publicity around this proposal and the need for it to be so hard-hitting suggests that all water quality is declining. But MFE's own Environment Aotearoa 2019 report showed that 5 out of 8 water quality attributes had a majority of improving trends from 2008 to 2017. So in some places, land use restrictions, strict consenting regimes, and other aspects of this regulation just aren't required. A blanket approach isn't the right way to do this. Regional councils under the old national policy statement were required to do this on a regional basis, and lots already have, and lots are a long way down the track. So coming in over top of all of that with some national requirements that just don't have any logic at a regional level is hard to understand. It's been really great to hear from so many people who are putting their submissions together. A submission can be made by an individual or by a legal entity. Where an individual is part of a legal entity, you can submit one for each, and some people are doing that. But I just say be careful of copying and pasting. The reality is that submissions that are obviously identical probably won't get read twice. And if you've opened with some of the stuff that's the same as another submission and then put some different stuff down further in it, it might get missed if they think that it's just an identical submission. So think about what's different for the different entities that are submitting, and make sure that your submissions, if you're submitting for 2 different parties, aren't the same. Submissions don't have to be complicated, and they certainly don't need to be done by a consultant or a legal person. MFE themselves said, feel free just to answer one question. If there's one particular thing that really bothers you, tell them about that, or that you really like, tell them about that too. They can be really simple. They can even be handwritten. Ideally, put your name on it. But these documents, these submissions do become public. So if you don't want your name on it when it becomes public, tell them that, and they'll cross it out when the public version. Other details like your address and your email address are useful, but they're optional. And remember, these documents become public. So some key areas that impact farmers that you might want to consider in your submission. And there's a few different areas. So, if the first area doesn't apply to you, just bear with me and listen on, because there's a few different things I'll cover here. In fact, I'll just quickly let you know the things I'm going to cover are stock exclusion, just going down, stock exclusion, land use change, the rules around land use change, nutrient bottom line, so that includes nitrates and sediment, farm plans, intensive winter grazing, feedlots and stock holding areas, which has some little hidden tricks in it that might capture more people than realise, and exceptions for large hydro schemes. Those are the key areas I'm going to cover off in this wee video. So starting off with stock exclusion. This applies to lakes, rivers that are more than a metre wide, and wetlands. So I'll start off with rivers. Rivers more than a metre wide sounds like a reasonable river, but it's important to consider that this isn't necessarily the width of the normal flow of water. The definition in the RMA is the river width is defined by the fullest flow inside the bank. So it's not when it overflows the banks, but the fullest flow inside the bank. So quite often, not always, but quite often, the width of the bank is the easiest way to measure whether it falls into this rule. Whether drains are included or not is uncertain, because MFE have been a little bit inconsistent on the information on that. So if you think that 1 metre wide ruling will capture drains on your farm, you might want to let them know that, and what your view is on whether they should be part of the rule. If you don't think they should be part of the rule, give them some good reasons why. And give them some information about the drains on your farm and why you think they would be caught by that 1 metre wide rule. There's a few other things here for rivers. Stock exclusion from rivers will depend, and the rules around those will depend on whether you're on low slope ground or not. But even if you're in the hill country, you would need to fence off wetlands, and I'm going to talk about wetlands soon. So don't switch off if you're a hill country farmer, because there is some stuff here that could get you. So low slope. What low slope means is being consulted on. So should it be 5 degrees, should it be 7 degrees, or should it be 10 degrees? Remember, there's some people who will want to push this as far as possible. If you think it should only be for 5 degrees, say that. Others will be pushing for higher. On low slope land, all existing dairy and dairy support will have to be fenced out of rivers by the 1st of July 2021. And they'll have to be fenced out with an average of a 5 metre setback with nothing less than 1 metre. So average 5 metres, nothing less than a metre. Now, MFE have been quite clear that they're not requiring permanent fencing. So if you have paddocks that are hardly ever grazed, that are alongside a river, you could put up temporary fences during the period of time that they're in there. They don't have to be permanent fencing as long as the stock are kept out. So the stock exclusion is the thing, not the how. Beef, pigs and deer will also have to meet that requirement by 1st of July 2023. So just to recap that, on low slope land, existing dairy and dairy support will have to be fenced out of rivers by the 1st of July 2021. Average of a 5 metre setback and nothing less than 1 metre. And then beef, pigs and deer to follow by 1st of July 2023. On land that is not low slope, and remember, we're not sure what low slope is going to be yet, but could be 10 degrees, it could be 5, it could be in between. So land that's not low slope, that same rule, 5 metre average and 1 metre minimum, will apply by the 1st of July 2021 for all dairy cows. So they'll all have to be out of waterways regardless of slope. And for all paddocks where the feeding of fodder crops by break fencing, or where pasture has been or irrigated or is being irrigated in the last 12 months. So they'll all have to have fencing of waterways or exclusion from waterways by 1st of July 2021. By 1st of July 2023, and again this is on non-low slope land, by 1st of July 2023, beef, dairy support and deer will have to be fenced out of waterways on land that has a carrying capacity of 14 stock units a hectare at the whole farm scale, Or if the farm scales less than 14 stock units a hectare carrying capacity, then at the paddock scale, if that paddock alongside the waterway has potential carrying capacity of 18 stock units a hectare or more, then those animals would have to be fenced out of waterways by 1st of July 2023. Now, this carrying capacity thing is a wee bit tricky, and it's something to give some thought to if you might be in this area. This is not about your actual stocking rate. This is about the potential carrying capacity of your farm and or of that paddock. So given that this plan might restrict you from intensifying to its potential anyway, if you haven't fully developed your farm but it has that carrying capacity, you could get caught by this rule. It's intended to capture those really highly productive paddocks, the river flats and things like that, that might be on farms, the hill country farms and things like that. So that although they might have low stock units for most of the farm, these particular paddocks might have a much higher carrying capacity, and they want to make sure they capture those. But there could be some pretty unintended consequences for that if you don't actually utilise your farm to its carrying capacity. So that's something to have a bit of a think about. Wetlands. This is more relevant than many may realise, especially for hill country people who might not realise that they're captured by it. So a wetland, the definition of a wetland is a permanently or intermittently wet area, shallow water and land water margins that support a natural ecosystem of plants and animals that are adapted to wet conditions, whether they're native or not. But it excludes paddocks where water temporarily ponds in places dominated by pasture, and it excludes just wee patches of exotic sedge or rush species. It also excludes constructed wetlands and geothermal wetlands. So this is not just wetlands that are listed in the regional plan currently. So there's some regionally significant wetlands that the plan Environment Southland already has noted. It doesn't just include those. It includes all things that fall in that definition. Permanently or intermittently wet areas, shallow water and land water margins that support a natural ecosystem of plants and animals that are adapted to wet conditions, whether they're native or not, but not just for temporary ponding. So if it's a wetland, regardless of slope, it must be fenced for dairy support, pigs, beef and deer by 1st of July 2021 if it's identified in the regional plan, or by 1st of July 2023 if it's not identified in the regional plan. So what they're saying is they don't care whether it's identified as regionally significant. If it's a wetland, it's to be protected. So that's something to really think about. Slope doesn't matter. So give some thought to whether that will affect you and how it might affect you. A couple of other key things about stock exclusion to bear in mind. All new pastoral systems will have to fence all of those stock exclusion rules or meet all of those stock exclusion rules straight away as soon as this plan becomes effective. And any existing fencing that doesn't comply with those requirements will have to be moved to meet the requirements by 2025 unless it has a minimum average of 2 metres and is no less than 1 metre away from the waterway at any point. If it has a minimum average of 2 metres and is no less than 1 metre away at any point on it, then you've got till 2035 to shift it. This is interesting because Minister O'Connor said in Gore that no fences should have to be moved, but that's not what the rules say. So you have to have your say on this. If you're going to have to move fences, what will that cost you? Do you think there'll be any benefit to water quality as a result of shifting those fences? What will it cost you? What might you otherwise spend the money on that might have better water quality effects? And do you think 5 metres is even reasonable? My personal opinion is that 5 metres is excessive, except where there's bare soil. So sure, if you're winter cropping, put up a temporary fence or waratah fence or whatever to keep them 5 metres away during the period of that intensive winter crop. But once it's regrassed and back in permanent pasture, I think 5 metres is pretty excessive. That's just my view. Make sure you have your say on it. Right, so another key set of rules in these documents is about land use change. Basically, these rules say that until regional councils have their own limit setting plans in place, this National Environment Statement, the new National Environment Statement standard, will tightly restrict further intensification of rural land use for more than 10 hectares of any farm. So if you want to intensify more than 10 hectares of any farm, you may be caught by these rules. So the restrictions are where you want to change from woody vegetation or forestry to pasture, where you want to change from sheep and beef, arable or deer to dairy support or dairy farming, and where you want to increase your irrigated, pastoral, arable or horticultural production. The other thing that's also restricted is any increased area of winter crop beyond the maximum total that you had in any one year from 2013 to 2014 through to the 2018-19 season. So if you think about those years, 2013-14 right through to 2018-19, what was the maximum area of winter crop that you had during that time? You would need to get a consent to increase the area of winter crop beyond that maximum. So those, none of these things are in theory blanket banned, but you'll have to get a resource consent to do them. And to get that resource consent, this is where in theory they're not banned, you'll have to prove no increased emissions of nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment or other pathogens compared to what you had in the 2017-18 year. And that's regardless of whether those emissions are an issue in your area, whether they're likely to cause negative consequences, whether your emissions in that year were high or low. Regardless, you'll have to prove that you're not going to increase them. And you'll also have to prove that you're avoiding adverse effects on freshwater from the activity. So that's a pretty high bar, and it's particularly concerning for whatever reason. If you had low stocking rate or anything in that 2017-18 year, you won't be able to increase your emission of nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment or pathogens from that year, regardless of whether it was even whether it was high or low in the first place. So that's going to have a significant impact on the versatility and responsiveness of farming operations in the face of changing markets, economy, any other influences. Several people have pointed out the lack of logic around being able to bring in additional adult beef cattle, but not dairy support calves. It seems a bit crazy. The restriction on increasing land area for winter grazing could also pose challenges and won't necessarily benefit water quality. What if you wanted to move away from fodder beet, for example, to a less productive crop like Swedes, or to a lower yielding but higher quality variety of kale? The restriction is on land area, not on crop yield or number of stock units or anything like that. So that's another thing that's well worth having your say on. How will it impact your operation? How might it actually have an adverse effect on water quality or impose a high cost without a benefit to water quality? Nutrient bottom lines. This is another area that will have some significant impact for some. So currently there's two key bottom line areas on nutrients and waterways, nitrates and E. coli, and they're national bottom lines. This plan makes the nitrate limits across the country much stricter, and it adds new bottom lines for sediment and periphyton, which is algae or slime. It's really difficult to quantify the impact of these things on your own farm because the information just hasn't been made available to this level. But the key thing is that national levels for this stuff just doesn't make sense. For example, with nitrogen, even the MFE officials have pointed out that some parts of the country already meet the bottom lines for nitrate with no real issues, yet others will see a significant production cut to existing farming to meet those new bottom lines, and for some areas, farming under those limits just won't be possible. It's really important to note that there are large areas of Southland's most productive farming land caught by this, and the high-level maps suggest that a cut of 25 to 50% would be required to nitrate levels in those areas. So how would that play out? How that will play out on your own farm isn't certain, but if you already know your numbers around nitrate losses, what would be the effect of you having to reduce your nitrate losses by, say, 25%? Now, I'm sorry I'm being Southland specific, sorry but not sorry. I'm Southland Fed's Vice President, and this, I know Southland better than I know other areas, but you can read into this what you like for your own area, and I know that other bits of this are relevant nationally, so apologies where I get a bit Southland specific. So yeah, if you already have some knowledge around your nitrate losses and you're in low-lying areas of Southland, other than the Waiau catchment, because that's not caught by this, then have a think about what effect there would be if you had to reduce your losses by 25%. Sediment is another new bottom line, and this also has potential to be a massive thing for Southland because sediment is one of our biggest challenges here, but I know it affects other areas too. The thing in Southland, and again, think about whether this applies to your area, is we have huge modification of our waterways in Southland. Back in the days before flood banks, when lots of those rivers were in flood or at high flow, the water would spread out over a massive area of plains, and therefore the sediment would be dropped over that massive area as well. Now we have flood banks alongside most of those waterways to protect the towns and protect the farms. So we've created this great big funnel system where the water and the sediment just goes firing straight down the river, it doesn't spread out, and it ends up in the estuary. Not only that, in some cases, our estuaries have been massively modified. For example, one in particular that has got a massive amount of area reclaimed, with a lot of Invercargill City and including the airport built on top of it. So we've created this big funnel that fires a whole lot more water and sediment down the river to the estuary, and we've reduced the size of the estuary that then has to absorb it. So it's no surprise that that estuary is struggling. But asking us to fix it when we're not going to take away the flood banks, and I don't think anybody would want us to. So yes, farming can have an impact on how much sediment we put into waterways, and actually those mitigations are reasonably easy to implement in many cases. We're not going to make a game-changing difference to the amount of sediment ending up in that estuary. We can have an effect, but if they're expecting us to get those waterways back to pre-flood bank quality, I'd question whether it's actually even possible, and whether we'd want to deal with the consequences of achieving that. So that's something to have a think about. Algae, I'm not a scientist and this is not my area of specialty, but I've had quite a few people raise to me the issue of Didymo. Again, this is really hard to quantify, but my understanding of this is that as Didymo is not specifically excluded from the measurement of periphyton, it would therefore be included. So in some waterways around the country, Didymo is a huge issue. It's not the only algae in waterways, undoubtedly, and absolutely there are some things farms can do to reduce nutrients going into waterways that would then have a positive effect on the amount of slime in the waterway. But what impact are we going to have on Didymo, and is anyone else being expected to do something about that? Or is it only the stuff that farmers can influence that has to be fixed? So that might be something you want to submit on. E. coli is another one. Yes, we can have some influence on the amount of E. coli that ends up in waterways, but are farmers to blame for all the E. coli in our waterways? Absolutely not. Another issue that many people have raised to us, and it's been raised time and time again, particularly in Southland, is around ducks and the amount of E. coli they put into waterways, particularly in Southland. The contribution that one duck makes to waterways of E. coli is equivalent to a significant number of cows. Off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure it's 16. I've been waiting for some confirmation of that. I'm pretty sure it's 16 cows that it takes to make the same contribution of of E. coli into a waterway as one duck. So again, if every other part of society is being asked to do so much to mitigate the negative effects of water quality and E. coli, remember, is the biggest thing for swimmable waterways, is it time to reconsider the protection of non-native ducks? If swimmable rivers are so important to us all, and it's clear that they are, surely this is something we need to be thinking about. So I know I'll be submitting on that. Excuse me. Farm plans. These are going to apply to and cost money for every single farm. For higher priority areas, farm plans will be compulsory by mid-2022. And when I say higher priority areas, there's a list of catchments that are identified, includes all of the Southland catchments except the Waiau, plus several others around the country. So they'll all have to have a farm plan in place by mid-2022, and everyone else by the 31st of December 2025. So the thing about these farm plans is they'll have to be certified by an approved planner. To do that, that planner will need to be all over your farming operation and the detail of your plan. And the plan will then also have to be audited every second year by a different approved auditor. MFE themselves estimate the cost of that to be $3,500 for the actual plan to be produced and certified, and then another $1,500 every second year for the auditing. On top of that, in their own estimates, which are in the back of this discussion document, they also estimate that the average cost for implementing the requirements of the plan, so the things that you have to do on your farm as a result of the plan, will be an average of $15,000 per annum. So it doesn't really match with Minister O'Connor's comments that good farmers won't have to fork out because of this plan. If nothing else, there's $3,500 every year for a certified plan plus $1,500 every second year for the auditing. So we know that there's going to be cost to this, but yeah, their own estimates average of $15,000 a year per annum for the things that we'll have to change on farm through that farm plan. Really key and interesting thing here is that all of the advisory groups that input into the development of these documents, so remember the ministers have been saying that they didn't just come up with these rules, they had advisory groups that developed it. All of those advisory groups were against the certification and auditing of farm plans. they know, and they knew, and it's documented, that farm plans are a really useful tool. But as soon as you involve a regulatory process around them, they cease being a useful tool and start being a tick box exercise. Yet the ministers, for whatever reason, went against that advice and have put in this provision about them all having to be certified and audited. So that's maybe something you might want to have a say about. Just going into that in a little bit more detail. So adding layers of regulation to farm plans, as I mentioned, takes them from being a useful tool. And at the moment, I mean, I know lots of farm plans, ours include aspirations, proactive measures, things we want to work towards over a long period of time. Now, if they're going to be certified and audited, and we're going to be held to implementing everything that's in them, we'll take all of that stuff out. We'll put in there what has to be in them, so that we can get through the regulation. So they'll stop being a workable, useful tool. And at the moment, they don't really cost us except our time, and they're a useful thing for us, so we don't mind doing them. Now they'll become a costly piece of paperwork that actually aren't useful. I can't see how water quality is going to benefit from that. Planners will. There's going to be lots of people that make lots of money from them, but how water quality is going to benefit, it's hard to see. Plus, it's really hard to see where the required numbers of all these planners and auditors are going to come from in such a short period of time. That high demand in a short space of time is very likely to mean that the quality of their knowledge and input will be reduced. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Right, winter grazing. This is a massive area for Southland and Otago and for some other parts of the country, but if this isn't your cup of tea, bear with me and I'll get onto the next thing soon. But intensive winter grazing. So intensive winter grazing remains permitted under strict conditions, and anything outside of those strict conditions will need a consent. Those conditions are, it needs to be on low slope. Now, low slope in this case, they're consulting, should it be less than 10 degrees or should it be less than 15 degrees? And that's up for consultation. You can bet where some of the environmentalists are going to be submitting that it should be. And, you know, for lots of us, even 10 degrees even 15 degrees is pretty concerning. The Southland Water and Land Plan had suggested that 20 degrees was the right level, and lots of farmers had concerns about that. So the level of slope, if either less than 10 degrees or 15 degrees, depending on where this lands. The total area on any one farm will not be allowed to exceed, and again there's two brackets here which they're considering, either 30 hectares or 5% of your total farm, whichever is greater, or the other threshold they're considering is 50 hectares or 10% of your farm, again whichever is greater. Another thing that you'll have to do to make sure it's a permitted activity, you must graze downhill from top to bottom. That's good management practice anyway, and many people already do that, but I'll talk a bit more about that soon. There will not be allowed to be any grazing in the critical source area. So where you've got sloping ground, and remember it's going to have to be not very sloping, but any sloping ground, the critical source area where the water all arrives in and flows back out of the paddock, no grazing in that. So basically don't crop it, fence it off, no grazing in it, even at the end. Good management practice at the moment suggests that you graze it last, but this is saying no grazing at all in that critical source area. There'll have to be, and again there's two different thresholds here that they're considering, you'll have to have a buffer between the winter crop and a waterway or a drainage ditch, and that buffer will need to be left uncultivated and ungrazed. They're consulting on should that be 5 metres or should it be anything from 5 metres up to potentially 20 metres. So they're also consulting on 20 metres. Where do you think that buffer strip is appropriate? These next two are interesting. So another provision to have this as a permitted activity, the grazed paddock will have to be resown within 1 month or as soon as practicable after the end of grazing. Not really sure what as soon as practicable means. I don't even know if they know, but we know without any shadow of a doubt that resowing winter crop paddocks within 1 month of finishing the grazing is almost never practicable, and actually often will result in much worse outcomes because everything's just still far too wet. So yeah, you just end up with failed crops and mud being dragged out onto roads, tractors getting stuck, more damage to the soil structure, failed germination because the conditions are still too cold. And on top of that, actually, many farmers are calving or lambing during that time, so just actually unable to do the work at that time. So goodness knows where that provision certainly didn't come from anybody that knows what Southland winter grazing paddocks are like for a month after grazing. yeah, anyway, so that's an interesting one to submit on. And the final provision in there for a permitted activity is that pugging doesn't exceed an average of 20 centimetres, but they're also consulting on 10 centimetres over more than 50% of the paddock. I actually think in reality, for most cases, that's probably not a big deal, but I just don't actually know how practically it will be measured and, monitored. So that rule, although those depths probably aren't too much of a big deal, the practicalities of monitoring that, I just can't really get my head around. So that's something else to consider. So all of that. So basically, if you can't meet all of those things, you'll have to get a consent for your winter grazing. That will be really, really significant for Southland. And I'll give you an example on our farm. I used this example in the tractor talk, so if you've seen it, I apologise, but it's a useful one. So there's quite a few articles have done the rounds recently from Environment Southland giving advice about planning ahead for winter crops for next season. And there's been some pictures included of farms with good management practice and some bad management practice examples, or some poor practice examples. Some pictures of our farm have actually, it was quite cool, been used as examples of good management practice in some of those articles. The paddock that they've been using is one that has quite significant slope. I think it's about 16 degrees, depends on where you measure it. But yeah, when we did measure it, it ranged between that 14 and 16 degrees. So it's got quite significant slope down to a massive critical source area in the bottom, and that actually captures way further back up the valley. So a lot of water goes down that critical source area, and we're very, very aware of that. Actually, now it's got a sediment trap in it. But when we winter grazed that, it didn't. But we didn't cultivate the area at the bottom, and we fenced it off with waratah fencing for the entire duration of winter, and it never got grazed, that critical source area. So that buffer strip with long grass in it was left alone, never touched, and we grazed on either side of the slope. We grazed across those slopes because grazing top to bottom on slope like that, we know, I mean, that's why these rules exist, that the soil shifts. And on our soils, that soil does shift down, and it ends up with the soil covering, or the mud covering, the next feed of crop. And so the cows are unhappier, they eat far less. We only had young stock on there, by the way, not dairy cows. We had R1s on there. But also they struggle to eat, downhill under the fence. It's not actually very easy for the stock to eat it. So they're way less satisfied, therefore they pace more. It just doesn't work grazing top to bottom on many of those slopes. So we grazed across, but we had that strip at the bottom to capture any sediment that did make its way to the bottom of the hill, and it did a really good job of that. So that's an example of where we were already doing what we needed to be doing to mitigate the effects. Now we'd have to get a resource consent to do that. The resource consent would check that we're doing all the things that we do anyway to avoid the negative effects. So there's not going to be any benefit to water quality from that resource consent. It will cost us a whole lot of money to be able to prove that we're mitigating the effects. Then we get on and do it the same as we were doing it anyway because we're already doing it right. So it just that's a perfect example of where people doing it right will get pinged. Water quality won't be better off for it, and there'll just be a whole lot of wasted money that'll go into the coffers of planners and the council. Another thing about this winter grazing stuff is we know that an area limit on winter crops, so limiting the amount of area you can have on one farm, can actually drive worse outcomes. I used a couple of examples there earlier, but it basically just drives you to grow more of your intensive crop, to grow more intensive crops and add more supplement into those paddocks. Actually, better outcomes are gained by reduced intensity over a bigger area. At the end of the day, stocks still need to be fed. So pushing them off one farm because you've reached the limit on one farm and onto another farm just sends them somewhere else. It doesn't reduce the amount of feed which is needed. That crop is still going to have to be grown somewhere. Overall, the same amount of feed will be needed in the province. What difference does it make if lots of it's on one farm and not another? So that's a real concern, that rule. It can actually drive much worse outcomes. I've mentioned the stuff about the re-sowing after a month of grazing and the pugging depth. I won't go into any more detail about those. But yeah, this intensive winter grazing stuff has potential for massive impacts and some perverse outcomes. And this is where putting that international regulation doesn't make sense. There's been a lot of work done in Southland to try and figure out where the best place is to land this stuff for intensive winter grazing. Environment Southland did a huge amount of analysis before they came up with their rules. It's going through the Environment Court process. Very soon there'll be mediation where all the parties with the Southland Water and Land Plan will get around the table and try and work out what is sensible. Let's just let us do that. Why do we need to have these national rules coming in over the top of a process that's already underway, and we'll actually come up with the right solution for for Southland. Okay, enough about that. Sorry, I'll get off that bandwagon. Nearly at the end now, a couple more key things. Feedlots and stock holding areas. Now, this bit's a bit surprising, and you might not think you're caught by this, but listen, because you might be. So this provision could see a requirement for a new set of wintering sheds and even potentially calf and lamb rearing sheds to be consented and meet a new set of criteria. So from when I questioned MFE on this at their online meeting, and it seems that wasn't the intention, but the way the rule is written, that would be the outcome. So this is a classic case of what I mentioned earlier, that regardless of their intention, the words on the paper, the legal documents, are what are going to matter. So currently in the rules, a feedlot is defined as a stock holding area in which livestock are confined for more than 80 days in a 6-month period and are completely hand or mechanically fed. So the discussion document states that there's 5 feedlots in New Zealand, but when you think about that, 80 days in a 6-month period, completely hand or mechanically fed, pretty much captures every wintering shed, certainly in Southland, where the wintering period is usually considered to be at least 100 days. But I asked them about that, and they said they hadn't intended to capture wintering sheds by that rule. So they have, so we need to tell them about it. If you've got a wintering shed that would be captured by that rule, tell them. And then so other than feedlots, there's other stock holding areas. Other stock holding areas will also require a consent if they contain animals for more than 30 days in a 12-month period or more than 10 consecutive days. And so that is where calf and lamb rearing sheds might get captured, which, again, I seriously doubt was their intention, but could have massive consequences. So both of those would require a consent. They'd have to meet a range of conditions, including the floor would have to be sealed to minimum permeability standards. It'd have to be located more than 50 metres away from water bodies, ditches, bores and coastal areas. And all effluent and water or bedding material containing effluent will have to be collected, stored and disposed of according to regional council regulations. So there's a whole heap of potential unintended outcomes from this provision, and I'd really encourage you to consider how this might affect you and submit on it. At the moment, many small wintering sheds don't need a consent. We've got one. This encourages an alternative wintering option, which can improve water quality outcomes on some farms. So yeah, we've got one of those. It houses about 80 R1s each winter, usually beefies actually. And they're on straw bedding, which we compost and then spread onto the paddocks at a time when the paddocks can uptake the nutrients. That would need a consent going forward. We also grow arable. We're short of grain storage. To be perfectly honest, getting a consent for that shed would probably drive us to just use it as a grain storage shed and not bother using it for wintering, which would mean we'd put those animals outside and winter them on the paddocks, which is what we were trying to avoid by doing it in the first place. So that would definitely be a negative outcome for water to meet these rules. Also, removing flexibility around the shed space that you can use for calf and lamb rearing just complicates a really challenging time of year, particularly when conditions might get difficult and you might want to keep calves in for longer than you would normally do so. So yeah, putting strict requirements on those sheds is really likely to have adverse animal welfare outcomes, and I'm sure they don't intend that. But again, that comes from a different government department, so that's one of the challenging things around rules like this. But yeah, have a think about whether that's going to impact you and have your say. Right, the last thing I want to go into a little bit of detail on, and it won't be that much detail, but is a provision in the National Policy Statement which exempts large hydroelectric schemes from the requirement, or the waterways that they're on, from the requirement to meet water quality bottom lines. So there's six named hydroelectric schemes, large ones, and the waterways that those schemes are based on will be exempt or have the option of exemption from the requirement to meet water quality bottom lines. And the purpose of that is to make sure that the largest hydro schemes aren't required to alter their output due to freshwater aspirations and rules. And what it means is that the local regional council is given the ability to make their own decisions in consultation with the community about what water quality bottom lines will apply to that waterway. So it kind of sounds sensible, but it's a really challenging philosophical debate. And the biggest concern is that is the likelihood that once this exemption is written into national legislation, then there might be, and it's likely there would be, a significant legal battle for any council that wanted to impose rules that would reduce the take of those large schemes. Obviously, with climate change, green power generation is really important, but does it make sense that we can effectively sacrifice the waterways that those hydro schemes are on? That's a philosophical question that people need to think about. It's a particularly contentious debate here in Southland with the Manapuri power scheme, because that completely diverts water from the Waio to generate electricity. Most of New Zealand's hydro schemes, the water runs through the scheme and then carries on down the river. But in the Waio, the water never returns. The water is diverted and goes off to the power scheme, and a little trickle remains travelling down the original Waio River, which now flows at a fraction of the rate that it did naturally. It was once called the mighty Waio. It's not so mighty now. Those in the Waio catchment need to really give this consideration and submit their views. The general view seems to be that a small amount of additional water flowing down the Waio, which would mean a small reduction in the take from the power scheme, would make a significant difference to the health of that waterway. They're not asking for massive amounts. They're just asking for a bit more to go back down the original river. But yeah, as I said, there's real concern that once there's an exception written into national legislation, that there'd be a real battle on their hands for any council that wanted to reduce the water take of those schemes. So if that applies to you and it's relevant to you, please have a think about that. Right, so I think that'll do. As mentioned earlier, there's lots of information available on the Fed Farmers website, also Beef and Lamb and Dairy NZ, and I'm pretty sure Hort NZ and FAR have also issued information to their growers. If you're a bit cynical about the value of engaging in this process, my message to you is please do it anyway. This is our only chance to have our say. Making a silent protest by ignoring the process is just going to be taken as acceptance. So by all means, I understand your cynicism, but please do it anyway. And the last thing I want to say is don't be overwhelmed by this. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Just pick one thing to have your say on, and then if you feel like getting into something else, do that. You don't have to tackle the whole lot. Your own knowledge and experience on these things is exactly what MFE needs. That's the knowledge they lack. So anything you will contribute will be valuable. So please just put pen to paper or get on the keyboard and bash out a few lines. And if it grows from there, fantastic. And if that's all it ends up being, that's great too. Thanks very much for listening. Feel free to find me questions back via the Southland Federated Farmers Facebook page if you want, and I'll do my best to answer them or get them answered by someone with more knowledge than me. And hope this is useful. Thanks heaps again for your interest and for your commitment to farming. Cheers.